Racist cop arrests black man. He freezes in court when he learns the man is state's chief prosecutor. The morning sun stretched lazily across the sleepy suburban streets, casting a golden glow on the well-kept lawns and parked cars. Officer Clayton Price, a veteran cop with 20 years on the force, cruised slowly in his patrol car, scanning the neighborhood. His sharp blue eyes lingered as he spotted a sleek black Mercedes parked outside a modest home. The driver, a black man in his early 40s, was rummaging through a leather briefcase in the passenger seat. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Something about the scene prickled at Clayton's instincts. Not the car, not the man's actions, but the man himself. He hated to admit it, even to himself, but his assumptions always spoke louder than his reason. "Suspicious," Clayton muttered, pulling his cruiser to the curb. The man, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, didn't notice Clayton's approach until the officer was tapping sharply on the driver's window. Startled, the man rolled it down, his expression polite but cautious. "Problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. "License and registration," Clayton demanded, his tone clipped. The man frowned slightly but complied, handing over the documents. Clayton barely glanced at them before continuing. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? This your car?" The man's frown deepened, though he remained composed. "I'm heading to a meeting downtown, and yes, it's my car." "You got proof of ownership?" The man raised an eyebrow. "The registration is in your hand." Clayton's jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." "Why?" "I said step out of the vehicle," Clayton barked, his hand hovering near his holster. The man sighed and got out, his movements slow and deliberate. Within minutes, Clayton had him cuffed, ignoring the protests of bystanders who had begun to gather. The precinct was buzzing when Clayton marched his detainee through the front doors. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in a residential area," Clayton announced loudly, as though he'd just apprehended a fugitive. The desk sergeant raised an eyebrow as the man, now sitting calmly in an interrogation room, waited for someone to take his statement. "Doesn't look like much of a threat," the sergeant muttered. Clayton shrugged. "You never know. He had that look." Hours later, the man was brought before the court for arraignment, still in his suit but now flanked by 2 deputies. Clayton sat smugly in the back of the courtroom, arms crossed, ready to watch the case unfold. He had written up a report that all but guaranteed a conviction: suspicious activity, failure to comply, and resisting arrest. It didn't matter if some of it was exaggerated. His word carried weight. When the judge entered, everyone stood. But when the clerk announced the prosecutor for the case, the room fell into a stunned silence. "Representing the state, Mr. Darius King, Chief Prosecutor of the Attorney General's office." Clayton's heart dropped. The black man in the suit rose from the defense table, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He adjusted his tie and stepped forward, addressing the court. "Your Honor," Darius began, his voice steady, "before we proceed, I'd like to clarify a few things for the record." The judge, equally shocked but maintaining composure, gestured for him to continue. Darius turned, his piercing gaze locking onto Clayton. "I was arrested this morning under charges of suspicion and resisting arrest. Charges brought against me by Officer Clayton Price." The courtroom murmured, but Darius raised a hand to silence them. What Officer Price failed to mention in his report, likely because he didn't bother to verify, is that I am the chief prosecutor for this state. I was en route to a critical meeting regarding law enforcement reform. Clayton's face turned pale as whispers swept through the courtroom like wildfire. Darius continued, "The irony of my arrest is not lost on me, Your Honor. But this incident is not about me. It's about the unchecked prejudice that allows someone like Officer Price to abuse his authority, to judge a man by the color of his skin, rather than the content of his character. Or in this case, his credentials." The judge leaned forward, her expression stern. "Officer Price, please step forward." Clayton hesitated before standing, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. "You are aware of who Mr. King is, correct?" the judge asked. I didn't know," Clayton stammered. Darius interjected. And that, Your Honor, is precisely the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am. What matters is that Officer Price acted on assumptions, not facts, and those assumptions could have destroyed an innocent man's life, again. The room fell silent as Darius recounted stories of victims wrongly accused and imprisoned, weaving his own ordeal into a larger narrative of systemic injustice. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The judge dismissed the charges against Darius and ordered an immediate investigation into Clayton's conduct. As Darius left the courtroom, Clayton remained frozen in his seat, his career and reputation unraveling before him. Outside, reporters swarmed Darius, but he paused only briefly. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "This is about accountability, for every person who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or wrongfully accused. And I promise you, this is only the beginning." With that, he walked away, a man on a mission, leaving behind a justice system that would never be the same again. Darius stepped into the sunlight, his composure intact, but his mind raced with plans for what needed to happen next. The cameras followed him relentlessly, reporters shouting questions that he ignored. A black SUV pulled up, and Marcus, his longtime investigator and confidant, leaned out from the driver's seat. "You ready to take this further?" Marcus asked as Darius slid into the back seat. Darius nodded, loosening his tie. "Oh, this is far from over." Inside the precinct, the fallout had already begun. Officer Clayton Price sat at his desk, staring at the statement he'd been forced to write about the arrest. The words blurred as his mind spiraled into panic. The internal affairs team had already arrived, questioning his colleagues and pulling his record. A small but damning stack of complaints against him was growing by the hour, and the whispers in the precinct stung more than he wanted to admit. "Price!" barked the desk sergeant, snapping him out of his daze. "Chief wants to see you! Now!" Clayton hesitated. He knew what was coming, but there was no escape. As he trudged to the chief's office, his stomach churned. Meanwhile, in the Attorney General's office, Darius was mapping out the next steps with his team. "This isn't just about Clayton Price," Darius said, standing before a whiteboard filled with names and dates. "This is about a pattern. I want every complaint filed against officers in this precinct. I want body cam footage, internal reports, anything that connects the dots." One of his junior prosecutors, Melanie Rivera, raised a hand. "Do you think Price acted alone, or is this systemic?" Darius's eyes darkened. "Systemic. It always is. Clayton is just one cog in a much bigger machine." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And you're going after the whole machine, aren't you?" Darius turned to him, his jaw set. "Every last gear." The investigation moved swiftly. Clayton Price's arrest record was scrutinized, revealing a troubling pattern of disproportionately targeting Black and Latino men. Body cam footage exposed his often hostile interactions, and witnesses from the community came forward with stories of harassment and abuse. But it wasn't just Clayton. Darius's team uncovered evidence of a precinct culture that encouraged racial profiling and rewarded officers who brought in high arrest numbers, regardless of the legitimacy of the charges. The deeper they dug, the more connections they found. It led to a network of precincts across the county, all operating under a quota-driven system that disproportionately targeted minority communities. One evening, as Darius reviewed files in his office, Marcus entered with a grim expression. "We found something," Marcus said, placing a thick envelope on Darius's desk. Darius opened it and froze. Inside was an internal memo signed by the precinct's former captain, an explicit directive instructing officers to prioritize arrests in minority neighborhoods to meet quotas. The memo was dated 5 years earlier, the same year Clayton Price had been promoted. Darius's hands trembled slightly as he held the memo. This was the smoking gun he needed, but it was also deeply personal. His late father, a community organizer, had been arrested and sentenced unjustly during that same year, a case overseen by the same precinct. "I knew it," Darius whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "They destroyed my father's life to keep their system running." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll make them pay for it, Darius. Every last one of them. The trial was a media spectacle. Darius led the prosecution himself, delivering opening arguments that electrified the courtroom. He painted a vivid picture of a corrupt system fueled by prejudice and greed, exposing how officers like Clayton Price were mere pawns in a game controlled by those at the top. But the most shocking moment came when Darius called the former precinct captain to the stand. "You authorized these quotas," Darius said, holding up the incriminating memo. "You knew they would disproportionately target minority communities. Why?" The captain squirmed in his seat, sweat glistening on his brow. "It was policy," he stammered. "I was just following orders from higher up." "Orders from whom?" Darius pressed, his voice razor-sharp. The captain hesitated, then broke. "The county commissioner. He demanded high arrest numbers to secure funding for our precincts." The courtroom erupted in gasps. By the time the trial concluded, the corruption had been exposed from the precinct level all the way to the commissioner's office. Clayton Price and his fellow officers were convicted, along with several high-ranking officials. Darius stood on the courthouse steps, addressing a massive crowd of reporters and community members. "This isn't just about one bad cop," he said. "It's about dismantling a system that profits from injustice. We've taken a step today, but the fight isn't over. It won't be over until every community can trust that justice is truly blind." As the crowd erupted in applause, Darius allowed himself a small smile. His father's legacy had not been in vain. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in years, it felt winnable. But the most shocking moment came when Darius called the former precinct captain to the stand. "You authorized these quotas," Darius said, holding up the incriminating memo. "You knew they would disproportionately target minority communities. Why?" The captain squirmed in his seat, sweat glistening on his brow. "It was policy," he stammered. "I was just following orders from higher up." "Orders from whom?" Darius pressed, his voice razor-sharp. The captain hesitated, then broke. "The county commissioner. He demanded high arrest numbers to secure funding for our precincts." The courtroom erupted in gasps. By the time the trial concluded, the corruption had been exposed from the precinct level all the way to the commissioner's office. Clayton Price and his fellow officers were convicted, along with several high-ranking officials. Darius stood on the courthouse steps, addressing a massive crowd of reporters and community members. "This isn't just about one bad cop," he said. "It's about dismantling a system that profits from injustice. We've taken a step today, but the fight isn't over. It won't be over until every community can trust that justice is truly blind." As the crowd erupted in applause, Darius allowed himself a small smile. His father's legacy had not been in vain. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in years, it felt winnable.